From a bilateral perspective, and there's obviously direct tensions between Australia now and China, do you think it gets to a point where Australia will just eventually have to choose to side more with the Chinese, simply because in terms of economic clout and economic need, that's where the incentives lie?
Well, the enduring wisdom of Australian foreign policy for some decades has been to deny the necessity of any such ultimate choice. And I think that's been sustainable up until now. In my own period as Prime Minister and as Foreign Minister of Australia, we were constantly faced with challenges in the China relationship. People seem to think this is only a recent set of dynamics, but I remember having to deal with Chinese human rights practices in Tibet and in Xinjiang. I remember also having to deny Chinese interest in taking over Rio Tinto through its own state-owned firm, Chinalco. And I also remember the early evidences of China's more assertive posture in the South China Sea and changes to our defence policy back then. So at the same time, through that period, Australia's economic relationship with China went from strength to strength. Our trade grew, our investment relationship grew. I do believe ultimately this form of balance is achievable, but in order to do so, each country, including Australia, needs a coherent national China strategy, and we need to work in partnership with other countries around the world in our engagement with China as well. That's doable, and so that the binary choice, which you referred to in your question, doesn't ultimately hit all of us in the face. Remember, the United States itself avoids such a binary choice. Speak to those in Silicon Valley who export half of America's total exports to China through what it sells in semiconductors. So this mutuality of interest is not unique to Australia, it's across the world.
Mr. Rudd, I want to then get your thoughts on what's happening here in Hong Kong and arguably caught in between these, the people of Hong Kong. We know the situation with the special trading status, including passports, by the way. Do you think these moves out of the U.S. are hurting the people of Hong Kong more than the actual intended target, which I would imagine would be Beijing?
Well, I think since the passage in the United States Congress of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the designation by the Secretary of State Pompeo that Hong Kong no longer enjoys the high level of autonomy promised under the Joint Declaration and the Hong Kong Basic Law, that all eyes have been on Washington in terms of what will constitute the actual substance of America's punitive measures against either Beijing or Hong Kong. And unless something's broken overnight, and it's morning here in Australia, I'm still unclear as to what that final set of measures may be. There is a set of conflicts, obviously, within the United States in terms of the nature of any financial sanctions to be imposed, either against Hong Kong or against Beijing. For the simple reason you have in Hong Kong so many active American financial services companies with large business operations in Hong Kong and through Hong Kong to the mainland. So will the US act on that or not? Will they do something in terms of the automatic operation of the US dollar, Hong Kong dollar peg? Open question. But each of these actions has a consequence for American firms as well. So I would imagine that what's happening in the US administration at the moment is they're seeking to identify, A, measures which reflect American displeasure and broader international displeasure over what's happened in Hong Kong, B, not fundamentally damaging America's own financial interest itself in Hong Kong, and C, ensuring that the message is effectively delivered to Beijing. And there are many contending voices for this particular policy debate in Washington at present, and most of us are focusing very carefully on the final outcome of those deliberations.
Mr. Rudd, I just want to update you and our viewers on what we're hearing now from Australia. We have this fiscal update, and we've been hearing from the Treasurer. So just to recap some of the lines, Mr. Frydenberg saying that real GDP will be growing, is seen to grow at 2.5% in 2021. Australia's fiscal 2021 budget deficit is seen at 184.5 billion Australian dollars, We're hearing now from the Finance Minister, Mr. Cormann, who is speaking now, Matthias Cormann. So just some updates in terms of the fiscal situation in Australia. Of course, the deficit is expected to widen to about 10% of GDP. The fight against the pandemic continues, particularly in the state of Victoria. The question then, Mr. Rudd, for you is, what is the economic toll ultimately on Australia if the government of Scott Morrison continues along this path of being more robust in terms of its stance with China? What is the economic cost? How much pain can Australia ultimately take as they try to strike this balance?
Well, to make one observation about the numbers which have just been put on your screen about the level of debt and deficit now being undertaken by the Australian government. I was Prime Minister during the global financial crisis. We finished that period with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 13%. I now see that this is virtually doubled under the current government. I find it ironic that those of us who have come from a different political tradition, the Australian Labor Party, were criticised for borrowing excessively to deal with the financial crisis. We now have double the debt-to-GDP ratio in dealing with the current crisis. Anyway, as we know, debt and deficit are essential policy mechanisms for dealing with existential financial and economic crises. On the degree of difficulty for the future in engineering an Australian economic recovery, in large part it will depend on the ability of the Australian government to devise a national infrastructure investment strategy which generates sufficient confidence in the business community and sufficient employment over time to kickstart the economy back into gear over time. National infrastructure bonds are quite possible now because of negligible interest rates, and therefore the opportunity to reinvest in the Australian national electricity transmission grid, to reinvest in our national broadband network to make it fibre optic to the node. Projects such as this can actually kickstart the economy over time. With China, it is one further element in the complexity of Australia's national economic recovery strategy. But in overall terms, I've never known China to take actions against any particular economy which were not in China's own interest. And China still has a structural need for a range of Australian products and services into the future as well. But to answer your question, it's primarily what happens in terms of an enduring, long-term national economic recovery strategy in Australia, beyond these short-term fixes in terms of wage subsidies and unemployment benefits that the government has spoken about so far.